Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a video series and sometimes podcast about designing better miniature games. What do we know about designing miniature games? Well, we've designed a few, and my name's Mike. I've designed miniature games such as Gaslands and A Billion Suns and Perilous Tales and some others that will be coming shortly in the years to come. And this is Glenn. He's also designed many miniature games, some of which have graced the pages of periodicals such as Miniature War Games magazine and others besides, as well as routinely stabbing biros viciously through anything that I throw in his direction, which is extremely helpful and I welcome daily. My goodness, what are we talking about? Well, I've spent a lot of my complexity budget on this introduction, and I am only just able to remember that we are talking about, of course, the other half of this, which was cognitive load. Now, Glenn, you defined the difference between complexity budget and cognitive load thusly. Let's see if I can recall it. So complexity budget is how much newness and learning and innovation are you putting into your rules system so that when I pick up the rule book to Glenn's wonderful new miniature skirmish game, how much are you asking me to learn fresh versus just kind of going back to my existing knowledge of systems that look a bit like this and understanding sort of how 80% of the game already works just by glancing at it, but you've spent your complexity budget carefully on the bits of this game that really matter, the bits about pirates falling sideways because the boat is rocking, and we don't worry so much about the bits where they shoot their flintlock rifles. That's all super easy and as you'd expect. And so you contrasted, I think, nicely complexity budget with cognitive load, which I think I've been using those two terms interchangeably, but for the sake of having a useful distinction, cognitive load for this conversation is going to mean what are you asking the player to think about, make decisions about, calculate in their meat computer, in their meat-based rules computer whilst actually playing the game. So we'll assume that, broadly speaking, all the players at the table understand how the game is supposed to be played and how are they making strategic decisions and tactical decisions and moment-to-moment in-game decisions, and where are you asking them to spend that time. And I will somewhat throw my hand a little bit and say, are you asking them to do a bunch of mathematics in order to establish what the target number of a dice roll is, or are you asking them to think about where are they going to spend their resource and should they hold this resource back or should they place it? And I think, as we'll talk about as well, like, am I spending a lot of time trying to figure out what is even happening on this table filled with miniatures versus making clever decisions about what I'm going to do or what I think you're about to do and how I'm going to counter it? Is that about the shape of it?
Yeah, I think basically. So I think that two of the big sort of demons to slay for cognitive load are sort of calculating and bookkeeping.
Yep.
So talk a bit about those. So this is this is about making sure that the brain space that your players have is being spent on the crunchy, interesting puzzles that are fun to engage with, as opposed to doing math. You know, you don't ultimately want your players to be coming to the tabletop and multiplying 8 by 14, you know, repeatedly, and that's what's taking up the vast majority of their brain space. You want them to be looking at visual spatial relationships and figuring out tactical ways of outwitting the other person, and giving them a cognitive load that is the cool stuff rather than all the baloney.
And I want to catch on that, because that's a great point. I want to catch on that and just dig on that kind of at a high level here, which is when you're making things that people are going to interact with, there's this idea of usability, and like there's a classic statement which is "don't make me think." I think there's even a book entitled it, which is like, when you're building a task-based design for something, like, try and figure out what it is that the person is trying to get done and make it really, really easy so that when I walk into the ER, I can just see where I go and tell someone that I've broken my arm. Or when I load up a web page to buy a shoe, it's really clear to me where shoes are and how I buy them. And that "don't make me think" thing isn't actually what you want in a war game, because you do want people to think, you do want them to spend their time thinking about things. The important thing is, what are they spending their time thinking on? Are they cross about the fact that they have to add 700 numbers together, or are they thinking about the clever trick that they're going to do because they figured out what you're going to do, because you believe they figured out what you're going to do next, and so forth and so on. So it's kind of interesting because it doesn't adhere to the normal usability rules, but I think some of the usability rules really come strongly out, which is, so you started talking there about bookkeeping and what I refer to as game state, which is like, how easy is the situation to read, like, and I think part of that is like, how much are you as a games designer providing to your players in terms of widgets and ding dongs and boxes to tick and suggested ideas for how to manage all the complexity that's floating around in the game. Because if you glance at the table and there's a load of hidden information or missing information, that can be really difficult, because then you're using your brain to like, oh, did he have 6 wounds or 7 wounds? I can't remember. So then everyone has to put dice down and tokens down and blah blah blah, and then your table is a sea of tokens and dice, and it doesn't look right, and you're not kind of in the narrative anymore, because it just looks like it looks really a lot like a game. But also then you have to look at all those numbers and think about all those numbers, and so for example, like, how many variable statistics, how many resources are there that each model can have? And I think probably we'll want to talk a little bit about, we kind of touched on this before, but like the number of models and the detail that you go to are clearly, they're obviously linked. It's not genius to say that. But that's also because as you're looking and analyzing the state of the board, like, I don't want to know, of all of the Space Marines, I don't want to know which of them has got 6 shoelaces done up, their shoelaces done up to 6, and which has got the shoelaces done up to 7, and that gives them a quarter of an inch more movement. Like, that's too much detail.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the interesting things. I was reading a book recently about designing war games, where they sort of said the scale of the minis and the tabletop kind of don't matter. It's kind of just a personal aesthetic choice. We have X many operating things on a given tabletop that can do X many things in a turn and take X amount of punishment. It doesn't really matter if it's 50 guys in a unit or one guy at, because we're operating a different scale, so that one guy can take 50 hits at a different level as opposed to the unit. It still, you tend to ask players to engage with roughly the same number of activatable objects in any given game. There's not a huge amount of we talked about this about 3 or 4 episodes ago, and we talked about the 7 ± 2. So like, if I play a game of Warhammer 40,000 Apocalypse, like, the game designers of the most recent Apocalypse have very cleverly grouped together all of your models so that there's only really 7 or 9 like blobs that move around, and when I activate something, it's only one of 7 or 9 blobs. Then there's a bit of detail that I have to zoom in and so forth. But yeah, whether it's 7 cowboys or whether it's 7 absolutely monstrous regiments of goblins, it's still 7 things that I have to worry about the position of and the status of, and and I think
they have.
The number of models you have in a Malifaux warband and the number of units you have in a Warhammer army are roughly the same number of things, because that's about where people can handle when things are going well dealing with things. So I think there's a term that's often used. It's a little bit of jargon that you hear from gamers, and that's sort of being able to grok the tabletop. And I do like it. I think it's a programming term, and that's about whether you can look at the tabletop, you can look at the game state, and you can understand it, you can read it, whatever term you want to use for it, just by standing there next to the table. You can understand what's going on with everything. All the conventions are visible to you, things aren't hidden off the tabletop. And I think that's part of the, let's say, the first of these 2 sort of big issues for getting your cognitive load in the right place, and that's about how you deal with bookkeeping at the tabletop. You never want to ask a player to have to remember an uninteresting or unimportant number and just hold it in their head. It's a pointless feat, to test somebody's memory in this sort of game. If there's a number that persists from one turn to another that relates to something on the tabletop, you need to have a way of noting it, of letting people perform bookkeeping.
Now, this is one of the intriguing differences between board games, which are pre-packaged component products, and miniature war games, which tend to be DIY systems. Because I think whilst I agree with what you're saying, because from a usability point of view, like provide some mechanism for the player to be able to actually record that. I think a lot of systems, rightly or wrongly, just sort of assume that you'll figure that out. Now, Gaslands doesn't. It provides boxes with check boxes that you record your hull, and it gives you little printable hazard tokens, and it tells you to put a D6 in a square that's exactly shaped for a small D6. But a game like Malifaux has an absolutely batshit variety of different tokens and states and burning and poison and unique things that come off every model. And like the game just says, you have like, squelching in your pants +3 condition, like record that somehow. And I don't know if they just assume everyone's got whiteboard markers and laminated cards, or they just assume that everyone is paying hundreds of pounds to print like custom laser cut tokens. But I'm sure, boy, how did I end up with a lot of laser cut tokens whilst playing that game. And I think that much as I love that game, I think that's a really tremendous example of being sympathetic to the fact that you are a mostly do-it-yourself war game, where I might, for example, buy some miniatures from you, but if you don't sell me a set of componentry to record the state which you are asking me to record, like, are you actually just asking me to spend a bunch of my time thinking about, how did we record wounds again? I can't remember. We use dice. It's just easier. Okay. Do you count up or do you count down? Oh, I count up. Oh, okay. All right. I'll change the way that I do it because this is the way that you do it. And all of that, like, just give me a free download that I can print off that just has some boxes and I can use a pencil. Like paper and pencil are pretty easy. And even if you just say pencil and paper, like, and you explain how people are going to do it, like, I think this is, in terms of bookkeeping, I guess my observation is I don't see enough games just making it transparent how the designer expects you to keep track of all these things.
Yeah. Like I said, I've got a pack of Guild Ball widgets here for noting various dates in Guild Ball, and that, to be fair, is a game with a very static number of acting unit elements on the tabletop. You literally can't go above a certain number, and they all have to sort of fit into these certain slots, and so it gets away with a lot of those. I think what's interesting about Malifaux, since you mention it, is that the first edition of Malifaux didn't have all the status effects that it now has. The original version of Malifaux, the first book, I think, had poison and maybe defensive stance to note, and that was, I'm not even sure it had defensive stance. And then they introduced burning, and then they
provided little circles that you colored it, little bullet holes that you colored in on the cards to record wounds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that there, and if you come to Malifaux now as a brand new player, the fact that you're going to have to sometimes note like 8 different status effects that all interact in different ways and are turned off in different ways is brain flattening in the sort of the cost that it takes of you. But I think that they got away with it because they took players, it came in one step at a time. Maybe that's a question about bloat or something else that we can refer to. But
I don't know. I mean, I think in terms of cognitive load, like, I think unlike complexity budget, I actually think that cognitive load potentially has different ceilings depending on your players or depending on the expectations that you set on the game. Maybe this is true of complexity budget as well, but like, I have learnt certain games ask more of me, And so I don't bring them to the table when I'm tired and it's the end of the week and I've had a real tough week and I'm, haven't been sleeping well. Like, I'll bring something that I know has a lower cognitive load, and that lower cognitive load may be partnered with a less satisfying strategic experience, but it may be that it's an equally satisfying narrative experience. But as a player, I'm happy to in one situation, I'm happy to go, right, I am up for a 3-hour absolute brain scratcher versus, I just want 90 minutes of like pushing this guy forward and pushing that guy forward and rolling some dice and finding out if they beat the snot out of each other.
I mean, I would take the position, and I would argue, in particularly in relation to game design, that a game that has a high number of moving parts is not necessarily a game that's inherently going to be offering more to a player. The fact that it has a heavy cognitive load and you've got to track a lot of moving pieces often makes you feel like you're doing a lot, but there is a lot of it sometimes it's just cognitive busy work.
Yeah, no, that's true.
I mean, genuinely, and I'm quite good at that kind of cognitive busy work, and quite often I come across games that generate these sense of complexity and mental intricacy by just making you do this cognitive busy work. And because I happen to have a higher capacity for that than a lot of people, those games are just unbelievably crushingly dull and transparent, where we're just doing busy work. Of course it's that, and it's that, and then it's that. I mean, where's the weight to it? It's like, well, the weight to it is that you've got to track 4 or 5 different moving parts that will have numbers attached. Yeah, I happen to have a freakish ability to do that. If that's all it is, that's just the most boring, dull experience I can possibly imagine.
I think, as you're speaking there, I think one area in war games where you can add a bunch of cognitive load during play, because I'm actually thinking about this in terms of the game that you and I were playing last night, which we were playing some Arkham Horror. And Arkham Horror, the card game, tends to introduce new mechanics and make you solve rules interactions in a very dynamic way. And the equivalent for that in wargaming is either having a broad spectrum of models that interact together in very intriguing ways, like a kind of War Machines Horde type situation, or having a very broad range of scenarios where each scenario brings a very different way of approaching victory, such as in something like A Billion Suns, where a lot of the head scratching at the table is like, how do I win? What is even the condition for winning here, or what are the situations that I need to sit up? And in some regards, like, it's perfectly possible to create a system where, as you say, like, you're doing a lot of work to figure out how do I even win, but that work is not leading to is not a satisfying experience of solving a puzzle. It's simply like churning through some meat in order to get to the end of that.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, and as I say, in relation to bookkeeping, if you're asking players to hold in their head a given state of a given model, and states, I think, particularly are one of the worst offenders in this. I think that wounds, people are used to tracking things like wounds and et cetera, but states are a nightmare because each of them has slightly different rules interactions attached to them. Oh, you're on fire, you've got to roll on the ground to put yourself out. Oh, you've got acid on you, you've got to roll in muddy ground to counteract the acid. Oh, you've got pee in your hair, you've got to,
this is the sort of thing that computer games are really good at, and
absolutely,
humans are really terrible at.
And the thing of it is I think that if the game says, okay, whoever is best at holding all those states in their heads simultaneously in their interactions gets a significant advantage or even wins, it's basically the mental equivalent of sort of saying to somebody, okay, it's a running race, but you've got to keep these plates spinning next to the side of the track. Who cares about the plate spinning? No one cares about the plate spinning, but if they fall off, you lose. We're trying to see who can run fastest. We're just unnecessarily adding in this plate spinning malarkey just to see because the running's too easy. And it's like, I don't want to be spinning these plates. And I mean, okay, except people might want to, but I think personally, it's worth being very careful about what bookkeeping you ask people to do, and the value of that cognitive load that you're putting on people for things like states, for things like, and I think this conversation came up in relation to degradation mechanics that we mentioned before.
Yeah.
Is how the degradation kicks in and how it affects a certain model and which level the model is at the certain time. I just think you really have to earn something for it, and it has to be something more than just putting mental pressure on your players to see which of the donkeys collapses first, and the person who's still standing with their brain not smushed under the weight of it. Yeah, I won. I have a more resilient brain spine, and victory is mine. But we'll move on slightly from bookkeeping to talk about its near neighbor, calculations, and asking people to do calculations at the tabletop. Now, I think the one rule of thumb I have in relation to making people do calculations is try and keep calculations on the output end of what's happening at the tabletop. If there's an input calculation, which is what I mean by that is, if somebody has to do some basic maths in order to understand the chances of what they're doing succeeding, or whether a particular plan or tactic is a good plan or tactic to adopt, try and keep that maths relatively simple. Because they're going to have to do it in their head privately without letting the other person know that they're doing it in order to keep the game interesting.
Yeah, so this is just to reiterate that this is like, in terms of if you're asking your players to calculate things, try and keep that away from the decision making end of the system, because I need to be sitting there looking at things going, okay, I want to consider 12 different situations or 8 different tactics simultaneously, and I don't want every one of those 8 scenarios to involve me doing a bunch of maths. I want to be able to feel them.
Yeah, and then once the thing has occurred and the dice have been rolled and everything's come out on the table, you can make it fairly mathsy and put some calculations in there, because everybody can join in and do that maths together. Once the dice are out there and there's a thing and it's just a set of mechanical operations in order to, go through the steps to regulate it out, we can all join in and we can all do it as a team, and we can check each other's answers. So I think you have much more...
Can you give us a worked example of that to demonstrate, like, because in some regards, like having a bunch of modifiers on a dice roll, like that's an output complexity in terms of calculation, but like in order to understand how I come to that, like what's a method of not forcing me to do all of that maths up front to understand the chances of success?
I mean, I think a lot of games do this on a basic level. So for example, we were talking earlier about the shooting in Gaslands. Let's just take that as an example. The shooting in Gaslands is that it's a 4+ to hit, and then a 6 to save, and 6s are criticals. Now, realizing that if you're rolling 10 dice, a 4+ means you're going to get about 5 hits, and then probably one of them is going to be a crit, and they'll probably save the crit because you're rolling 6s, they're rolling 6s. There's around 10 dice, probably even out, probably around about 5 hits, more or less in the ballpark. Then when you roll the dice, you've then got hull damage, which can cause something to be destroyed and cause it to flip and cause it to blow up. When it blows up, it hits 5 different things, and all of them roll different dice, and all those dice give things hazards, and the hazards cause things to wipe out, might cause other things to blow up. It's like, my decision to shoot you is based on a relatively simple set of calculations. I have to halve the number of hits, and then for every 6 dice rolled, add 1 on or take 1 off. That's fairly simple. the mechanics of then enacting that and the explosion of exponential results to it, and the dice that I have to do, and then, oh, okay, I've hit you, you've blown up. How does the exploding rules work? Well, we can all join in and find the exploding rules, because that's a joint operation. We're all, operating that part of the machine. We're all joining in to make that work through. We try and keep the bit that you have to privately decide as low on calculations and rules and load and problems. You just have to go, is this a good idea? Is this a good decision or not? And then when things get rolled and calculated out, and like say in Warhammer, it's that thing of, okay, I've got X many dice, and then you roll X many dice, and I've got special interactions from my unit, and this spell has done this other thing to you. Those are all things we can do as a communal act of calculation and mathsing out, as opposed to the way that you make the decision can be more sort of loose and ballparky, and yeah, it's pretty much about the right idea and do it. And you don't have to go, okay, I have to actually count all the numbers up. I'm rolling 20 dice and I'm looking for 4s. Well, everyone can do that. We can join in and do that. We can all look for 4s together, and then we can go, is it 3s and then 6s? No, it's 3s and then 5s, because you're on toughness and I've on, oh yeah, I forgot about your extra pip of strength from your halberd and whatever it is. So that's what I mean by trying to make sure that the more mathsy, addy, calculatey, looking at numbers bit is something that can be done a bit more communally, and the bit that you need to do to actually make your decisions you can do in your head without being crushed by the weight of it. And I think one that pushes the envelope on this, I think that we've mentioned before, is like, for example, Infinity. Infinity asks you to do quite a lot of quite mathsiness in your head to make decisions that you really can't reveal to the other person that you're doing. And also what's deeply difficult is that they ask you to make, I mean, this is kind of intrinsic in the system, but they ask you to make them in sort of split-second moments. So when I make a short action to move from one place to another, and I'm about to make another short action to make a subsequent move, in that heartbeat, I have an opportunity to say, I'm going to shoot you. And so, like, I didn't necessarily know that you were going to cross my line of sight, but knowing now that you cross that line of sight, I need to make an instant decision about whether my D20 +8 +6 minus your 3 plus my other 3 for the ammunition that I can select is sufficient to get against your D20 with your camo that's -6 with your +3 because of the, and it's like, that's so much maths to do in like 1 second that it's like you actually have to ask the opposing player, could you mind just holding your second action for a minute, because I just need to scratch my head for a hot second here. And I think the thing is, it's a great example, actually. And I think part of the point is that Infinity revels in that. It's almost proud of the fact that it puts that weight on you. And what I would say is there's not a large niche for games that can get away with asking that of you. And I think Infinity might have already filled it, so maybe leave them to it and try something else. But generally, yeah, the thing that the version that Infinity asks of you, I think, is, a very specific and bespoke piece of filigreed speciality, and I think you would be unwise to attempt to replicate that. I think that most of us have to go down that more Gaslands end of it, of waiting until it's public information before we ask a lot of emergent complexity to be dribbled onto the top of the dance. And I think maybe to loop these two conversations back on each other, like the good thing about deploying your complexity budget in areas where it really matters to the game is that everywhere that you have not spent your complexity budget, everywhere that you have used mechanics which are extremely familiar to the player, and they'll have instincts already baked in about what a good decision looks like from their other experiences of playing games. And so the complexity budget has a direct impact on the cognitive load during play, which is, if I can see a couple of like weapon skill numbers and strength and toughness numbers, and I can basically see what the outcome of that combat is going to be through my experience, then
I can make that decision making in a very instinctual, sort of experience-based way. And then I can spend my time thinking about what I'm going to do with all of these magical cards that you've given me in your special system.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think you know, the rule of thumb here again, and this tracks back to the complexity budget conversation, is figure out the things that you want your players to be thinking about. Give them as many easy ways of noting and getting around the things that you don't want them to think about. And the things you probably shouldn't be asking them to think about is, can you do basic math at a tabletop whilst under the pressure of somebody else throwing dice at your head? That's not a particularly delightful question to have answered. You know, and if it is going to get answered, it'll get answered pretty quickly, and we'll know in about 4 minutes who it is that's best at doing that, and then we can move on to doing something more interesting with our time. Try and ask them, you know, better questions and help them out to not have to answer the less interesting ones. You know, give them ways out, give them ways of efficiently bookkeeping. States, you know, don't ask them to do too much bookkeeping. Let them be able to look at the tabletop and with one sweep of their eyes understand the things you want them to be able to understand at that point, which might not be the same for every game, and it might not be the same for your design as everybody else's, but there is something you want them to be able to grok instantly. Make sure they can do it, you know. And if you want something to be hidden from them at that point, go ahead and hide it, but you know, keep track of which those things.
But don't hide it because it's painful to work it out.
No, yes, no, don't, because some scumbag.
That's just very frustrating. Yeah, because some scumbag will see through it, and for everyone else, it'll just be very frustrating and exhausting.
Yeah, don't make a number hidden just because it requires somebody to memorize it and then base some part of your game on them not having memorized it, because somebody's gonna have memorized it and they're gonna ruin your game. You know, if it's useful to memorize it, just have it be open information, you know. Okie dokie. I think that's a sufficient chat on this particular subject. If you've watched to this point, I assume that you enjoyed watching us talk about this subject. If so, please like and subscribe. If you don't think that this was a sufficient level of chattery about this particular subject, let us know. We can and will talk more about it. We can and will talk more about
almost anything.
This chat was in response to a comment on a different chat, as I sort of mentioned. So if there's something you'd like us to talk about, if there's something that this conversation has sparked within your brain and you'd like to see us delve into, please let us know. Drop a comment. We will talk about almost anything, certainly anything to do with tabletop miniatures.
I will literally discuss which of my Chaos Call of Cthulhu RPG scenarios is my favorite.
We will talk about pretty much anything, you know, in relation to games design. So if you have a question, if you have anything, have a specific or you know, to do with your design, if it will be useful to have us chat about it, please let us know. Drop it into the comment section. But for now, look us up on social media, reach out to us. We love to hear your comments and feelings and ideas and suggestions. For this moment, however, we're going to say goodbye and sign off in this episode of Rule of Carnage. So goodbye.
Goodbye. Bye.